Don't you dare touch him when you're like this." The firm words of Jasmine Washington cut through the tense air of the Beverly Hills mansion's playroom, as the 34-year-old African-American nanny positioned herself protectively between 7-year-old Ahmad Al Rashid and his mother, Elena. 52-year-old oil magnate Hassan Al Rashid had just returned from a business trip to find his wife in what appeared to be an intoxicated state, attempting to force their autistic son to participate in activities that clearly distressed him. For 6 months, Jasmine had been Ahmad's primary caregiver, and she had never seen Elena interact with the child in ways that acknowledged his special needs or respected his comfort levels. Ahmad rocked quietly in the corner of the room, his hands covering his ears as he tried to block out the raised voices and chaos that his mother's presence had created. The little boy, who had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder 2 years earlier, required careful attention to his sensory needs and emotional regulation, but Elena had been trying to force him to wear scratchy formal clothes for a photo session that would have been overwhelming for any child with his condition. "You have no right to interfere with how I handle my own son," Elena slurred, her voice carrying the telltale signs of someone who had been drinking heavily despite the early afternoon hour. Jasmine could smell alcohol on her breath and see the unsteady movements that indicated Elena was in no condition to make decisions about Ahmad's care, let alone to physically handle a child who needed predictable, gentle interactions. "Mrs. Al Rashid," Jasmine replied calmly, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone who had extensive training in special needs childcare. "Ahmad is having a sensory overload episode, and forcing him to wear uncomfortable clothing or participate in activities that distress him will only make his condition worse. He needs calm, quiet time to regulate himself, not more stimulation and pressure." Hassan watched the confrontation from the doorway, initially confused about why his son's nanny was defying his wife's direct orders. But as he observed the scene more carefully, he began to notice details that revealed the true nature of what was happening. Elena's behavior was erratic and aggressive. Her demands were inappropriate for a child with Ahmad's needs, and Jasmine was clearly the only adult in the room who understood how to provide proper care for his son. The realization that his wife had been drinking during the day while alone with their vulnerable child filled Hassan with a rage that he struggled to control. But more than anger, he felt a crushing guilt as he understood that Jasmine had been protecting Ahmad from situations that could have caused serious psychological harm, while he had been absent and unaware of the problems in his own home. "Jasmine," Hassan said quietly, his voice carrying a new respect for the woman he had previously seen as simply hired help, "what exactly has been happening here while I was away?" The question was directed toward understanding the full scope of the situation, rather than questioning Jasmine's judgment, because it was becoming clear that she understood his son's needs better than anyone else in the household. "Mr. Al Rashid," Jasmine replied carefully, her primary concern still focused on Ahmad's immediate well-being, "your son has very specific needs related to his autism, and some of the activities and expectations that have been placed on him recently have been causing significant distress and regression in his development." She gestured toward Ahmad, who was still covering his ears and rocking in the corner. "He's been having more frequent meltdowns. His sleep patterns have been disrupted, and he's been showing signs of anxiety and withdrawal that suggest he's been experiencing ongoing stress and overstimulation." Elena attempted to interrupt with angry protests about Jasmine overstepping her boundaries, but Hassan held up his hand to silence his wife while keeping his attention focused on Jasmine's explanation. "Tell me everything," he said simply. "I need to understand what my son has been experiencing and what he needs to be safe and healthy." What Hassan didn't know was that Jasmine Washington was not just an experienced nanny, but a former special education teacher with a master's degree in autism spectrum disorders, who had been forced to leave the education system due to budget cuts. She had chosen to work as a private caregiver because it allowed her to provide one-on-one attention to children who needed specialized support, but she had never expected to find herself protecting a vulnerable child from his own mother's neglect and inappropriate expectations. Over the next hour, as Elena retreated to her bedroom to sleep off her alcohol consumption, Jasmine provided Hassan with a detailed assessment of Ahmad's needs, his recent behavioral changes, and the specific incidents that had caused her to intervene between mother and child. Her observations were thorough, professional, and heartbreaking in their implications for his son's emotional well-being. "Ahmad is incredibly intelligent and capable, Jasmine explained, but he processes sensory information differently than neurotypical children. Loud noises, scratchy fabrics, sudden changes in routine, and high-pressure social situations can trigger responses that look like defiance or behavioral problems, but are actually neurological reactions that he can't control. She showed Hassan documentation that she had been keeping about Ahmad's daily activities, his emotional responses to different situations, and the strategies that worked best for helping him feel safe and regulated. The notes revealed a level of professional attention and care that exceeded what Hassan had ever expected from household staff, but also exposed patterns of stress and regression that coincided with Elena's interactions with their son. Your son thrives with predictable routines, clear communication about expectations, and sensory accommodations that help him feel comfortable in his environment, Jasmine continued. But he's been experiencing irregular schedules, confusing mixed messages about rules and expectations, and pressure to participate in activities that overwhelm his sensory processing abilities. The specific examples that Jasmine provided painted a picture of a child whose mother either didn't understand or didn't care about his autism-related needs. Elena had been forcing Ahmad to attend loud social gatherings that caused him to have meltdowns, insisting that he wear formal clothing that felt unbearable against his sensitive skin, and punishing him for behaviors that were actually symptoms of his neurological condition rather than willful disobedience. More disturbing were Jasmine's observations about Elena's inconsistent presence and attention. There were days when Elena ignored Ahmad completely, leaving all of his care to household staff, followed by periods when she would suddenly demand his participation in activities that were inappropriate for his developmental needs. The unpredictability was particularly harmful for a child who required stability and routine to function successfully. Mr. Al Rashid, Jasmine said carefully, I want you to understand that Ahmad is a wonderful child who is capable of learning and growing and having meaningful relationships. But he needs adults who understand his neurological differences and who are committed to supporting his development rather than trying to force him to behave like a neurotypical child. Hassan found himself seeing his son with completely new understanding. For 2 years since Ahmad's autism diagnosis, he had relied on Elena to manage their son's special needs while he focused on building his business empire. He had assumed that a mother's natural instincts would guide her to provide appropriate care, and he had been too busy with international business deals to pay careful attention to the daily realities of Ahmad's life. But Jasmine's professional assessment revealed that his assumptions had been dangerously wrong. Elena had either been unable or unwilling to educate herself about autism spectrum disorders, and her approaches to parenting Ahmad had been based on denial of his condition rather than acceptance and support of his needs. The documentation that Jasmine had maintained showed clear patterns of Ahmad's behavioral improvement when he received appropriate care and accommodation, contrasted with periods of regression and distress that corresponded to Elena's inappropriate demands and expectations. The evidence was overwhelming that his son had been suffering unnecessarily because the adults responsible for his care didn't understand or prioritize his neurological differences. As Hassan absorbed the implications of what Jasmine had revealed, Ahmad gradually emerged from his sensory overload episode and approached them cautiously. The little boy's behavior with Jasmine was dramatically different from his interactions with his mother. He sought comfort from the nanny, communicated his needs clearly, and demonstrated social skills that Hassan had rarely observed when Elena was present. Papa, Ahmad said quietly, using the Arabic word for father that he rarely spoke aloud. Miss Jasmine helps me feel safe. When Mama is loud and pushes me to do things that hurt, Miss Jasmine makes it stop. The simple statement from his son confirmed everything that Jasmine had been trying to explain. Ahmad was capable of recognizing the difference between appropriate and inappropriate treatment, and he had learned to rely on his nanny for protection and understanding that he couldn't get from his own mother. Over the following days, as Hassan observed his household with new awareness, he began to see the full extent of Jasmine's role in maintaining Ahmad's well-being and development. She had created structured routines that helped Ahmad feel secure, developed communication strategies that allowed him to express his needs clearly, and provided sensory accommodations that reduced his stress and anxiety. More importantly, she had been advocating for Ahmad's needs, even when it meant confronting Elena's inappropriate demands and protecting him from situations that could cause psychological harm. Her intervention had prevented countless episodes of distress and regression that could have had lasting negative effects on his development. Hassan also began to understand the professional expertise that Jasmine brought to Ahmad's care. Her knowledge of autism spectrum disorders was extensive and current. Her behavioral strategies were evidence-based and effective, and her documentation of Ahmad's progress showed systematic attention to his developmental goals and emotional well-being. The contrast between Jasmine's informed, compassionate approach to Ahmad's care and Elena's neglectful, inappropriate treatment became increasingly stark as Hassan paid closer attention to his son's daily experiences. It was clear that Ahmad had been thriving under Jasmine's care, while suffering under his mother's misguided attempts at parenting. But the situation was complicated by Elena's growing resentment of Jasmine's influence and her resistance to accepting that Ahmad's autism required specialized understanding and accommodation. As Elena's drinking increased and her behavior became more erratic, her conflicts with Jasmine intensified, creating an unstable environment that was harmful to Ahmad's need for predictability and calm. The crisis came to a head when Elena, in a drunken rage, attempted to fire Jasmine for what she called interference with her parental authority. But Ahmad's reaction to the threat of losing his primary source of stability and understanding was so severe that Hassan realized he faced a choice between supporting his wife's destructive behavior or protecting his son's fundamental needs. The decision was made easier by Ahmad himself, who clung to Jasmine and begged his father not to let her leave. The little boy's desperate need for the one adult who truly understood and cared for him revealed the depth of Elena's failure as a mother and the extent of Jasmine's importance in his life. Hassan made the decision to retain Jasmine as Ahmad's primary caregiver while seeking professional help for Elena's drinking problem and her inability to accept their son's autism diagnosis. But he also recognized that Jasmine's role needed to be formalized and expanded to ensure that Ahmad received the consistent, informed care that his condition required. The transformation that followed changed the entire structure of Hassan's household and his understanding of his responsibilities as the father of a special needs child. Instead of treating Ahmad's autism as a problem to be hidden or overcome, Hassan began to see it as a neurological difference that required accommodation and support rather than denial and forced normalization. Jasmine was promoted from nanny to director of Ahmad's care team, with authority to make decisions about his daily activities, educational program, and therapeutic services. Her professional recommendations carried the same weight as medical advice, and her observations about Ahmad's needs became the foundation for all family decisions that affected his well-being. The changes in Ahmad's development under this new arrangement were remarkable. With consistent, informed care and protection from inappropriate demands and expectations, he began to flourish in ways that had been impossible when Elena's uninformed approach dominated his daily experiences. Hassan also began to educate himself about autism spectrum disorders, attending conferences and workshops that helped him understand his son's neurological differences and learn how to support his development effectively. The knowledge that Jasmine shared with him transformed his relationship with Ahmad and gave him tools for meaningful communication and connection with his son. His first step was attending a 3-day conference on autism spectrum disorders at UCLA, where he learned about sensory processing differences, communication challenges, and evidence-based interventions that could support children like Ahmad. The experience was humbling and enlightening, as he realized how much he had misunderstood about his son's condition and how many opportunities for connection and support he had missed. One of the most powerful sessions focused on understanding autism from the perspective of autistic individuals themselves. Adult speakers with autism described their childhood experiences, explaining how sensory overload felt, why changes in routine were so distressing, and what kinds of support had made the biggest difference in their development. Their insights helped Hassan understand that Ahmad's behaviors weren't defiance or problems to be fixed, but communication about his neurological needs and attempts to cope with an overwhelming world. Jasmine accompanied Hassan to several of these educational sessions, helping him understand how the general information applied specifically to Ahmad's individual needs and strengths. Her professional knowledge, combined with her intimate understanding of Ahmad's personality, created a comprehensive approach to his care that addressed both his autism-related challenges and his individual interests and abilities. The more Hassan learned about autism, the more he appreciated the expertise that Jasmine had been providing throughout her time caring for Ahmad. Her interventions hadn't been overstepping boundaries or undermining parental authority. They had been professional applications of evidence-based practices that supported Ahmad's neurological differences and promoted his healthy development. During one particularly meaningful conversation, Jasmine helped Hassan understand how Ahmad experienced the world differently from neurotypical children. His sensitivity to textures, sounds, and visual stimuli wasn't pickiness or behavioral problems, but genuine neurological responses that could be overwhelming and distressing. His need for routine and predictability wasn't stubbornness, but a neurological requirement for feeling safe and regulated in his environment. Understanding these differences allowed Hassan to see Ahmad's strengths as well as his challenges. The same attention to detail that made unexpected changes difficult also allowed Ahmad to notice patterns and solve problems in ways that impressed his teachers and therapists. His intense interests in specific topics, which Elena had tried to discourage as antisocial behavior, were actually sources of joy and learning that could be channeled into academic and social success. Within 6 months, Ahmad was meeting developmental milestones that his previous doctors had thought might be impossible, demonstrating social skills and communication abilities that emerged when he felt safe and understood. The progress vindicated Jasmine's professional approach and revealed the damage that had been caused by Elena's inappropriate treatment. Ahmad's improvements were documented not just through subjective observations, but through formal assessments conducted by independent specialists who were amazed by his rate of progress. His speech therapist noted significant improvements in communication skills and social interaction. His occupational therapist reported major advances in sensory processing and self-regulation abilities. His educational team documented academic achievements that exceeded expectations for children with his level of autism. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were in Ahmad's emotional well-being and family relationships. The anxiety and withdrawal that had characterized his behavior during Elena's inappropriate treatment were replaced by curiosity, engagement, and affection. He began seeking out interactions with his father, sharing his interests and achievements in ways that had been impossible when he was constantly stressed and overstimulated. Hassan cherished these new moments of connection with his son. Ahmad would approach him to share discoveries about his favorite topics, ask for help with projects that interested him, and seek comfort when he was tired or overwhelmed. The relationship that Hassan had thought might be impossible due to Ahmad's autism instead became deeper and more meaningful than many typical parent-child relationships. Elena's resistance to accepting Ahmad's diagnosis and her continued drinking eventually led to a separation that prioritized Ahmad's needs over family preservation. The decision was painful but necessary, as Elena's behavior had become increasingly erratic and harmful to Ahmad's emotional stability. Her refusal to participate in therapy or education about autism, combined with her escalating alcohol abuse, made it clear that she was unable or unwilling to provide the kind of stable, informed parenting that Ahmad required. The legal proceedings surrounding the separation were complicated by Elena's attempts to regain custody of Ahmad, but the extensive documentation that Jasmine had maintained about his care needs and Elena's inappropriate treatment provided compelling evidence about what arrangement would best serve his interests. Family court experts who evaluated Ahmad's needs unanimously recommended that Hassan retain primary custody, with Jasmine continuing as his primary caregiver. Elena's supervised visitations with Ahmad were initially difficult for everyone involved, as she continued to resist accepting his autism diagnosis and attempted to force inappropriate activities and expectations during their limited time together. But with the support of family therapists who specialized in autism, she eventually began to understand how her previous approaches had been harmful and started learning more appropriate ways to interact with her son. The process of Elena's education about autism was slow and sometimes frustrating, but it eventually led to improved relationships between mother and son. When Elena was sober and following the guidelines that specialists had developed for their interactions, Ahmad was able to enjoy visits with his mother and maintain a connection that was meaningful for both of them. 2 years later, Ahmad was attending a specialized school program that accommodated his autism while challenging his intellectual abilities, participating in therapeutic activities that supported his development, and maintaining meaningful relationships with adults who understood and accepted his neurological differences. The school that Hassan and Jasmine selected for Ahmad was specifically designed for children with autism spectrum disorders, with teachers who understood sensory processing differences, communication challenges, and learning styles that were different from neurotypical approaches. The curriculum was academically rigorous, but delivered in ways that accommodated Ahmad's needs for visual learning, hands-on activities, and clear structure and expectations. Ahmad's academic progress in this supportive environment was remarkable. His mathematical abilities, which had been overlooked in previous educational settings, flourished when presented through visual and manipulative methods that aligned with his learning style. His intense interest in patterns and systems, which Elena had seen as obsessive behavior, became the foundation for advanced work in geometry and logic that exceeded grade-level expectations. His social development also improved dramatically in an environment where his differences were understood and accommodated, rather than seen as problems to be corrected. Friendships with other children who had similar neurological differences provided Ahmad with peer relationships based on shared interests and mutual understanding, rather than pressure to conform to neurotypical social expectations. The therapeutic services that Ahmad received through his school program addressed his specific needs while building on his strengths and interests. Speech therapy focused on pragmatic communication skills that helped him navigate social situations more successfully. Occupational therapy addressed sensory processing challenges while developing independent skills that would serve him throughout his life. But perhaps most importantly, Ahmad was learning to understand and advocate for his own needs. With the support of therapists and teachers who respected his neurological differences, he was developing self-awareness about his sensory needs, communication preferences, and learning style that would allow him to succeed in increasingly independent environments as he grew older. Jasmine had become not just Ahmad's caregiver, but Hassan's partner in advocating for special needs children and families. Together, they established a foundation that provided education and support services for families dealing with autism spectrum disorders, particularly focusing on communities where cultural stigma and lack of resources created additional barriers to appropriate care. The Foundation's mission was based on their shared understanding that children with autism spectrum disorders could thrive when provided with informed, accepting support that accommodated their neurological differences rather than trying to force them to behave like neurotypical children. Their programs focused on educating families, training caregivers, and creating supportive environments that promoted development and well-being. One of the Foundation's most successful initiatives was a training program for domestic workers and childcare providers who worked with special needs children. Many families relied on nannies, babysitters, and household staff to provide care for their children, but these caregivers often lacked training in autism spectrum disorders and other developmental differences. The program that Jasmine developed provided comprehensive education about autism, sensory processing differences, communication strategies, and behavioral support techniques that could be implemented by caregivers without formal special education backgrounds. The training was practical and accessible, focusing on real-world situations and giving caregivers tools they could use immediately to improve their interactions with special needs children. Hassan's resources and business connections allowed the Foundation to expand rapidly, establishing programs in multiple states and serving hundreds of families who had been struggling to find appropriate support for their children. The Foundation's approach emphasized cultural sensitivity and community-based solutions that address the specific challenges faced by different populations. For Arab and Middle Eastern families, the Foundation addressed cultural stigma around developmental disabilities and provided education materials in Arabic and other relevant languages. For low-income families, they offered scholarships and sliding-scale services that made specialized support accessible regardless of economic circumstances. For families in rural areas, they developed online resources and teletherapy options that overcame geographic barriers to care. The Foundation also established a research initiative that studied outcomes for children with autism spectrum disorders who received different types of care and support. Their data consistently showed that children who were provided with informed, accommodating care developed better social skills, academic abilities, and emotional regulation than those who were subjected to approaches that tried to force neurotypical behavior. Ahmad's story became a powerful example of how children with autism spectrum disorders could thrive when provided with informed, compassionate care that respected their neurological differences and supported their individual development. His progress demonstrated that the limitations often associated with autism were frequently the result of inappropriate treatment and expectations, rather than inherent deficits in the children themselves. The Foundation used Ahmad's case with appropriate privacy protections as an example of how early intervention, appropriate support, and accepting environments could transform outcomes for children with autism. His academic achievements, social development, and emotional well-being provided hope and guidance for other families who were struggling to understand and support their special needs children. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing so this channel. Now, back to the story. Hassan's transformation from a businessman who had been absent and uninformed about his son's needs to an advocate and expert in autism spectrum disorders inspired other fathers and family members to become more involved, supporting their special needs children. His public speaking about the importance of education, acceptance, and appropriate support helped reduce stigma and encouraged other families to seek help rather than trying to hide or deny their children's differences. Hassan learned that his greatest responsibility as a father was not to change his son, but to understand him, protect him, and provide him with the support and accommodation he needed to reach his full potential. Jasmine taught him that love alone was not sufficient for raising a special needs child, but that love combined with knowledge, acceptance, and professional expertise could create miracles of development and connection. The transformation of their family showed that when adults were willing to prioritize a child's actual needs over social expectations and personal comfort, children with autism spectrum disorders could develop skills, relationships, and independence that exceeded everyone's predictions about their potential. Ahmad's journey from a distressed, misunderstood child to a thriving, confident young person demonstrated the power of informed care and unconditional acceptance in supporting neurodivergent children.